can hear me clearly. A warm welcome to you all, those of you here with us in Islington and London, and those of you joining online. This is a session being hosted by the CDAC network, which is about putting a spotlight on information. In crisis, the state of information and communication can be the difference between life and death, loss or resilience. Rumours, fake news and hate speech can create confusion and harm at exactly the time people are forced to make impossible decisions, often very quickly. Transparency and truth are prerequisites for a functional humanitarian response. So why is information and communication still often considered nice to have in humanitarian responses? Are humanitarian actors keeping pace with the demands for information? And is it realistic to think that they have enough influence and control to shape the humanitarian communication environment to help people get the information that they need? These are some of the questions that we're going to be responding to over the next 50 minutes with our wonderful panel of speakers on stage and on screen. My name's Liz Hendry and I'm Programme Lead with the CDAC network. And I'm going to start with intros to Annie Slemrod and Meg Sattler, who are here on the stage with me. So to begin with Annie, Annie's an award-winning journalist, editor, and innovative storyteller who's worked in the Middle East for more than 10 years. She's the new Humanitarian's Middle East editor. Some of her recent work includes the Yemen Listening Project, an ongoing work of Arabic-English participatory journalism, and WhatsApp Lebanon, which told the story of Lebanon's economic collapse through the WhatsApp messages of 5 people. And Meg is CEO of Ground Truth Solutions, an international NGO organisation that aims to ensure that crisis-affected people have a say in decisions that impact their lives. Meg has spent most of her career working to improve accountability for people in crisis from different angles, in programming in Haiti, Pakistan, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq and Nepal, and more recently in global policy, holding advisory roles for UN OCHA, WFP, the START Network and more. Meg sits on several boards, including the Core Humanitarian Standard Initiative, Danish Emergency Relief Fund, the H2H Network and the Bedingo Community Bank, and has advised on many high-level processes on accountability and humanitarian reform. In a moment, we're also going to be hearing from a speaker joining us online, Stijn Albers from Internews, and we'll introduce him when he comes to us on screen. But our final speaker is Ahmed Al-Hamiri, who we're going to be hearing from in a minute on screen. Ahmed is a stabilisation, peacekeeping and governance expert with Chemonics, overseeing FCDO-funded programmes. He's the team leader for the Yemen Support Fund and programme director for the Women, Peace and Security Programme in Jordan. Previously, Ahmed was programme director for the Yemen Peace Building Programme and also served as a project manager for the FCDO's Syria Education Programme. Prior to joining Chemonics, he worked 7 years in advisory roles for DFID with an emphasis on Yemen conflict dynamics. And Ahmed is an achieving scholar and holds a master's degree in international politics from City University. Ahmed is travelling right now in Jordan and has recorded this message for us, which we're going to listen to first. So please can we run the film?
I am Ahmed Al-Hamiri, and I want to extend my gratitude to the CDAC team for this opportunity. Unfortunately, due to travel constraints, I'm not able to join in person. But I am grateful for the chance to connect with you virtually. So over the past 13 years, I have dedicated myself to the field of governance, peace, and stabilization, particularly in fragile and conflict-affected states, from collaborating with governments in the US and the UK to leading stabilization and peace-building initiatives for Chemonics in Yemen. My journey has been deeply rooted in the pursuit of positive change for communities that are affected by conflict. As a Yemeni myself, with loved ones still residing in Yemen, including my brother and my mother in Aden, the conflict hits close to home. Let me take you back to the onset of the conflict in Yemen, a journey that escalated 9 years ago, particularly March 2015. At the time, my family and I were living in Fajatan in Sana'a, an area that's surrounded by mountains and military bases, with my wife and our two young daughters aged 1 and 4. Our focus shifted to survival, rationing food, securing fuel, and ensuring the safety of our children amidst the chaos. Access to reliable information became paramount, and as we navigated the uncertainty of the situation, that continued to be the main focus. We needed to understand which areas were safe, how to sustain fuel supply, and what options lay ahead of our family's safety. Despite the risks and uncertainties, we made the difficult decision to leave Yemen. It was a journey fraught with danger and uncertainty, but we embarked on with hope for a safer future for our children. And as someone privileged enough to have options, I cannot grasp the challenges faced by ordinary Yemenis who lack access to basic information and resources. The dilemma of those in conflict zones like Yemen and the occupied Palestinian territories is unimaginable. Every day is a struggle for survival with basic needs hanging in the balance. As a conflict expert, I have witnessed firsthand the difficulties of communication and coordination in humanitarian crises. Addressing these challenges will most certainly demand a multifaceted approach, investing in robust communication systems, fostering trust amongst stakeholders, and most importantly, empowering local communities to lead their own efforts for survival.
Thank you very much to Ahmed there for sharing his experiences, both from his professional life, but also from his personal experiences in his home country of Yemen. Stein, I'm going to come to you next online, so I hope you can hear me. To introduce Stein, welcome, we can see you very well, is Senior Humanitarian Advisor for Internews, where he supports programming for natural disasters, conflicts and pandemics. He's implemented information ecosystem assessments and also spearheaded the trust analytical framework. So welcome, Stein, and thank you for joining at short notice, because we had a speaker who was due to join us from Access now, and Stein has stepped in at last minute. So it's wonderful to have you here. So Stein, to come to you first, we've heard from Ahmed about how important information was for him in his situation. But why do you think information and communication plays such a critical role in crisis? And what's different now compared to, say, 20 years ago?
Yeah, I think that the basic answer to that is, of course, that we believe that information is aid, and that people who are better informed can make better decisions and are therefore safer and better able to improve their situation and keep themselves and their loved ones safe or safer. So that's the short answer on why. I think if you ask me about what has changed, I think, everybody in the room will see where this is going. But I would like to point to 3 consequences, really. Like if we go back 20 years in time, pretty much the information that people would have access to was locally produced by a set of people who would translate that into the local context, would make a selection of what they thought was relevant for their audiences. While that now is completely out of the window, there was not only criticism on the sort of gatekeeping aspect of that, those newsrooms, those decision makers also in organizations were not always representative of the total population, like women very often being absent in those rooms. There is also, of course, additional opportunities, and that's where we are going with this answer. Social media, internet arrived. And I think that has done a few things, obviously. But one of the things, and I think coming out of a pandemic or at the tail end of it, we have seen how we have global platforms, but realities are still local. So that creates a dimension where people have access to all types of information, not only the information locally selected, curated, created, produced for them, but anything and everywhere, coming from everywhere. The other thing is, of course, there's a democratization of the production. Like everybody can produce information. So it has multiplied. And of course, now we talk about AI. The content production will go like multiply to an extent that we can't even really assess at this stage. So it means that suddenly people have a lot more information coming from anywhere in the world. And where 20 years ago, when we started as Internews, we would typically do an information needs assessment. And then the solution would be, we would create the information that would address those gaps. Right now, the situation is we have still information needs, local realities that are very particular, but also people have to navigate a multitude of information. And that means that the solutions also need to be quite different, I think. So maybe that would be the picture I would paint, like from 20 years ago till now. Like we need to design other types of interventions that don't just, assume that you can add information into the mix and that will then reach the right people and that those people will also trust that information.
Thank you, Stijn, for helping us to make sense of the current situation. Annie, I'm going to come to you next. We've heard a bit about the significance of information for people who are affected by crisis situations. From your perspective as a journalist, how are humanitarian agencies responding? How would you sort of characterise the state of humanitarian communication right now?
So as a journalist, I think a lot about audience. At the New Humanitarian, we have some pieces that are clearly targeted towards probably a lot of people in this room, very aid policy pieces. Those are maybe written in a certain way, distributed a certain way. We have other pieces that are targeted towards the broader public. I have a project which you mentioned, this Yemen Listening Project, which is in Arabic and English. It's not published yet, but you can look for it in late March. But it will be, because our audience is Yemeni in that case, we're going to be distributing it on channels that we know the Yemeni public uses. So in that case, it's going to be Facebook and WhatsApp. But the point is, I think from what I can tell, and I get probably all the press releases that aid groups send, I think that I seem to be the audience that aid groups are going for with their communications. I get sort of the same repetitive press releases. I know why they're sent, and sometimes they can be really useful. You see in the news people picking up clips of them because they need this information. But at the same time, I think from what I can tell, there's, I guess depending on how you define comms or communications, to use the proper word, we don't really see aid agencies communicating with the people who are actually receiving aid or supposed to be receiving aid. So we recently had a story a year after the earthquakes in northwest Syria, and our reporter who's from the region, pretty much everyone he talked to, whose homes had been destroyed, the main thing they said was nobody came and offered to help us fix their homes. And I went, and we spoke to various aid groups and aid agencies, and the fact is that's not part of the response plan in Syria right now. But nobody had communicated that to them. And there's a real gap there, and that I think can probably be filled with, probably wouldn't be that hard to tell them what they can expect, what they can't expect. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the way the aid world seems to think, or humanitarian world seems to think about comms, is directed at me as an audience, and there's a much bigger and maybe more important audience that really needs that information. That's a real opportunity.
Thanks, Annie. So arguably maybe the focus or the emphasis in the wrong place. And Meg, coming to you, in Ground Truth Solutions, you spend a lot of time listening to what people think about aid and, getting unfiltered feedback on people's experiences. Do you think that humanitarian actors are transparent in the way that they communicate?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me, and thank you to the huge audience that we have, which is great to see. It's a great question, and I want to get a bit meta before I answer it, because something I was really excited about with this panel was that the theme was truth and not communication. And if I think about some of the many sort of mea culpa moments that I've had working on accountability over the years and treating it potentially too much like some sort of technical skill, I think about all the discussions that I've had with people like Stain on panels like this over the years, where you talk about communication, and communication should be two-way, and people should have information about aid. And I wonder if we had thought more about the problem being a truth problem and not a communication problem, if that could have fast-tracked some of the solutions. And if we ask questions like, are we telling the truth to people in crisis, and are we prepared to hear the truth from them about some of our own programs? And I think what gets in the way of that, to get to your question on transparency, is sort of two things. I think one is a narrative problem. The sector has a huge problem with the way that it talks about itself. And, being in London, being in a taxi, listening to the radio, and you hear these ads about, here is a woman and she has to eat dirt, and this big agency will come and save her with some food aid. And this is what people are being fed, this narrative of people are nothing but aid recipients, and the people who are helping them are coming to save the day. And that doesn't leave a lot of room for complexity. And the other problem is just a big egos problem. I think in the humanitarian space there is so much insecurity, and people hate hearing anything that is not positive, which is very much linked to that narrative. And so because of that, when aid agencies look at, I am getting to your question, but what do people want to be, what should they be transparent about? The focus is often, do people know about distribution times? Do they know about how much aid they will receive and where they will receive it? And it's very limited to a very sort of limited group of humanitarian activities. And the work that we do at Ground Truth says that even that is not working. So people constantly say, I don't know how to access assistance. I don't know how long my assistance will last. I don't know why I was chosen to receive assistance or not. Generally, we talk to people who have been selected to be aid recipients, and sort of overall, on average, about half of them don't know how those decisions are made. But the other thing we learn is that that's not all the information they want. So they really want to know about what is the truth of the humanitarian space in my community. Often there's a humanitarian response that costs millions of dollars operating around them, and they don't understand it. And so I think to sort of tackle this issue of transparency, we have to also sort of recognise the huge barriers to that because of this global narrative and egos problem, and start chipping away a little bit at that as well.
Thank you, Meg. And I think we're going to come into some of this in more depth in a bit. Stain, I'm going to come back to you. I think an important point is about how humanitarian response actors are sort of a small part of the picture, and actually most of the sort of information flows and the information that people need is not coming from humanitarian actors, it's coming from within communities. So we're going to focus a bit on that now. But can you tell us a bit, in your work in Internews, what sort of strategies or responses have you sort of observed within communities of how people, share information and protect themselves from digital harm?
Yeah, those are a number of things. Obviously, people are communicating, are talking with each other, are looking for information, and will do whatever they can to be better informed and, to make decisions like, should I stay, should I go? All of these things, especially in a crisis, people are desperate for information, so they will do it. That's one. And I think for too long, maybe the humanitarian sector has sort of lived in the nice illusion that they could do things by themselves, and that people would come to them because we have the good intentions, and that would then ensure that they would have the right information and they would act upon it. One of the elements, and one of my favorite reports of the last years, was one of Ground Truth, where they revealed that depending on who was asking questions in Cox's Bazar, where it was like somebody of the Rohingya community or somebody from the Bangladeshi community, you would get very different answers. And that tells you something about coping mechanisms as well. People will not always want to share information and want to go to the information channel set up by humanitarians. We had another experience in Bangladesh where people were really worried to share their information with the humanitarians because they were afraid that the humanitarians would give it to the government. And so there was a lot of reluctance to access cards, vouchers, cash systems, access to warehouses where they would go shopping for food, because they were worried about the data that they would not have control over, and potentially humanitarians would, and potentially they did share it with the government. So that's people have coping mechanisms. People will go to the information that they think is the most useful, that might not always be reliable information, right? And so we have to be mindful that, there's things we do, but also if we don't do something, because we are, as a sector, quite risk averse, that will have effects as well. And people will revert to other channels, other sources. And some of them might actually be providing information they need, like how to cross a border, which is something typically humanitarians won't be able to give them for legal reasons. But the coping mechanisms that people have are also, they will be very inventive. Like we were working on our information-related protection project in Afghanistan, and you would see that women, for instance, were using the direct messaging on Instagram to exchange information with each other, because Instagram was not seen as such a controversial platform, whereas Facebook, they would be really facing consequences if they were seen having a profile on Facebook or using Facebook. So, people will have coping mechanisms. People will try to get access to SIM cards, even when they're legally not allowed to have a SIM card. And often local vendors will facilitate that. And that means that while there is the need and the eagerness to get information, and there is ways that they will try to avoid getting into trouble, and that includes avoiding sometimes our channels, we have to be mindful that the more space we leave for maybe less reliable actors, the more people will also have to take risks.
Thank you, Stijn. And I think, Annie, you also maybe had some examples to share about, particularly sort of digital channels that people use for sharing information.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency when there is an information gap, or it seems like there's an information gap, for a lot of places to think we need like a really complicated big solution that involves AI or something like that. But the fact is that people are getting information the same way that we're getting information. In Lebanon, if you need baby formula, or if someone needs blood donations, people post that on WhatsApp and on Twitter. It works. When people, as Stijn mentioned, need safe routes out of countries, they are exchanging it often on WhatsApp, on just nowhere that's really that shocking. I understand that in Gaza it's a similar situation. Maybe talking about safe routes is not the right word, but where you can go, where you should go, where you can get help, where your family is. And there are, of course, I guess if we want to use the word innovations, after the Libya earthquake, we saw, it's always the case, and it's almost become a cliche, that local responders are the first people to be there in a crisis. We don't always consider them aid workers, but people getting together to get food for people who need it, hosting people in their communities. And in Libya, we saw people coordinating just, again, through local Facebook groups, WhatsApp, etc., to send convoys of aid across the country. And there was a very quick, what I thought interesting response from some Libyans in tech who set up a database to keep track of people who were missing. because it was quite clear very quickly that the numbers were really large. No one really knew, and no one knew where to go to just say, this person is missing, this is the last time I saw them, this is what they were wearing, very basic stuff that, wasn't included in the emergency response. It was so catastrophic, and eventually that platform became part of the bigger response. So, I mean, I think it's quite common that, like I said, that we look to big innovations, but the innovations are already happening. People are already doing them for themselves. I think it's more about meeting people where they're at, talking to those people and funding those solutions.
Thanks, Annie. And I mean, when we were preparing for this, we were talking a bit about how, I mean, in a way, a lot of this is intuitive, because I guess for all of us, it's kind of, we're all kind of navigating information in our lives all the kind of time. But then, as you said, sort of, it's quite sort of incredible, maybe sort of understated how advanced some of these self-mobilised efforts are as well, and how often they do kind of come about where there are kind of gaps in the response. We're going to come back to the role of agencies, and we've talked a bit, Meg, about maybe holding a mirror to the sector, and is some of this stuff because egos are getting in the way of really sort of focusing communication on where it should be. But what's your sense on what aid agencies could be doing more of, maybe to kind of recalibrate and get the priorities better when it comes to communication?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that you made about meeting people where they are seems so obvious, but we still we really struggle to do that for whatever reason. We just did some work in Gaza where we were asking people about their sort of communication channels that they were using, and a huge percentage of that was radio, another one was face-to-face. To a smaller percentage, because of connectivity, there was, Telegram, WhatsApp. We also had a statistic that said that I think 89% of people at that time who we spoke to didn't know how to access humanitarian assistance, and about 6% of people thought it was worth going to humanitarian agencies for information. And so you present that to various humanitarian actors and the feedback is, but we have a hotline. So, this should be fine. I don't know why people don't know what we're doing. And I think sometimes we do have this. For a while it was apps and then it was hotlines. Now it seems to be dashboards. I feel everyone loves a dashboard. Like there's no communication problem that a dashboard couldn't solve. I know we're a bit basic in the sector, but I think getting rid of these sort of approaches that instantly jump to what is a technical solution that I can apply here, and just taking a step back and looking at, what is the situation, where are people getting information, how could we contribute if at all. And I think the egos point applies also at the sort of programmatic level, because even, for an organisation like ours, we're very small. Pretty much all we do is talk to people and try and find out with as much nuance as possible, what do they think of the aid system? How do they interact with it? How could it be better? What feedback do they have? And the more that approaches for, so-called accountability to affected people or communication with populations, the more that they get sort of popularised and professionalised, the more pushback we get also on, why are you doing that work? That wasn't part of our plan for the response. And so I think this need to sort of control everything that we have in the sector, and particularly that, a lot of the big agencies have. You see that play out in cash, you see it play out in protection, you see it play out in food aid, and we're seeing it now play out in just basic attempts to communicate with people. Everyone wants to have a good communication system that has their brand on it, and I find that a bit repulsive. I think we just need to be better at looking at what would work, and then understanding with a bit of humility sometimes the small role of humanitarians in that, and then finding a solution that might work. But we're not very good at that, because I think we have this egos issue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so snazzy dashboards are not the answer. We also talked a bit about how, maybe there's a fear about getting cancelled as well for agencies that plays into all of this in terms of the risk averseness of communication. I wondered, Annie, whether you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess no one wants to get cancelled, but I also can't figure out, like I saw a tweet recently, and I actually can't remember which agency it was, so I'm not going to call anyone out. But it was just like a picture of a woman with a box of aid with an agency's stamp on it, and it was like, look how happy she is that she got this box of aid. And I'm not saying people are not relieved to receive that box of aid, but I can't figure out really who that tweet is for. I can't, is it for a journalist who's going to pick up that tweet? Is it for the community that maybe doesn't actually read that language or use Twitter or X? Sorry. You know what? I'm just going to stick with Twitter. But yeah, yes, I think we've all seen the missteps on social media of people trying to be, of agencies and aid NGOs trying to be relevant, and it goes really wrong. But at the end of the day, I think that is also because you're trying to reach an audience that maybe shouldn't even be necessarily your audience. I think it's a lot more basic than anyone is, like you were saying, than anyone is really willing to admit. But there is a lot of ego in it. I mean, the press releases that say how many trucks are in your convoy, and that like you really need to get access is it can. I think it's sometimes there's like a competition even of press releases, and that plays a role in, I think, even getting the greater understanding of what's really going on. But I should say, I mean, there are sometimes a quote or a photo from those things can break through, and it can make an impact. It's not that it never happens. So it's a fine balance, I guess.
And if I can just come in on that quickly, because you can often see where that comes from. Like when I'm in Australia, I'm in a very small town, and people's understanding of the humanitarian system is very limited, and it's based on information that they get, whether it's from ads from big agencies or media stories that say something went wrong in this organisation, and then my whole town would say, oh, we better stop donating to humanitarian aid. So, you can totally see why there is this sort of paranoia from agencies to present a more nuanced picture, and also at the same time to take any feedback. So it's why, I really love the work that the New Humanitarian does, because it just sort of presents this more nuanced story of what is humanitarianism in this day and age, in all of its sort of messiness. And I guess the more that people understand that, the more this risk of getting cancelled would hopefully diminish, and maybe the more appetite for understanding that not everything is going to be perfect in the system, but let's try and do the best that we can. The more that sort of approach would take off, and therefore I think some of these accountability processes would become a bit more conducive. But at the moment there's a lot of layers that are sort of stacked against it.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And I mean, do you think, maybe this is a question that I can bring to you, Stone, but there's been some research which has sort of highlighted how most of the social media interaction that humanitarian actors have is with the sort of the giving public or with donors, compared to, for example, communities. Do you think this worry about kind of relinquishing control is one of the reasons that, humanitarian actors are not using social media as much as perhaps they could be when it comes to communicating with communities?
When we do our information ecosystem assessments, what you see is that humanitarian agencies still are broadcasting. And that's where I wanted to, that's the point that I wanted to make at the beginning, is that, yes, you can use social media to broadcast, to spread messaging. But if you look into the Facebook groups, like how they are dealing with the comment section, not so much, right? And maybe with a selection of the comments, but only the ones that they like. Because, the social media environment, and we all know it's complicated and it can be toxic and it can be, but so we would disengage, right? We don't want, and I think, we kind of know why that is, we're risk averse as a sector because we're so afraid of reputational damage, right? And social media is like this, cesspit of everything that can go wrong when it comes to your reputation. And so we rather disengage. But again, that also means that we are still broadcasting. We're not really engaging, and we're not really like listening and using that to respond to certain comments and criticism that people might have. But we cherry pick and we say, oh, this is something that actually we have a message library, we can respond to that comment. And so, yeah, reputational damage is definitely one of the main reasons. A lot of, like acknowledgement that it's complicated to engage with communities, with people, with individuals, because they're not, of course, like a homogenic a group of people. But I think my point is not doing it leaves a lot of space for others. And when we developed our trust framework, it shows, right? Like you can actually see that like not engaging with people and not actually responding to their criticism reduces the trust people have in us as a humanitarian sector, because we work a lot on mis and disinformation. Like the opposite of the mis and disinformation is actually not truth, right? It's not facts. The opposite of mis and disinformation is acknowledgement. And I do want to sort of make that little philosophical comment here with the title of the session. We have to be careful, and I've listened to what Meg said as well, like about humility. If we are going to claim the truth, that's going to be also antagonizing people, because truth, while it sounds like an obvious positive thing, truth is multifaceted. And what we see as in our assessments and in the work that we do around mis and disinformation is that one of the major drivers of people going to other channels and other people is that they don't feel seen, they don't feel heard, they don't feel acknowledged. So I always say the opposite of mis and disinformation is not facts, and is not, fact checking, and is not truth, but it's acknowledgement.
Thank you there, Stijn, for bringing a bit of nuance to that. We've got some questions coming in from those who are joining online. So if it's fine with you, I'm going to bring one question to each of you. So for Meg, somebody is picking up on the example that you gave about the NGO sort of talking about the woman who was kind of, forced to kind of eating dirt. So the question is, this harmful and false story of saviorism has been called out before, but how can we stop it? Is using a false narrative to obtain money not an act of fraud?
Great question.
Yes.
I don't know that I have a great answer to it, but I mean, one thing that we've been reflecting on, so this issue of the humanitarian narrative being very limited and controlled by humanitarian agencies and humanitarian activities is one that probably in all of our capacities we've all contributed to. And I know at Ground Truth in the past we've designed a lot of research around your experience as an aid recipient. And something that we really learnt in our recent work in Gaza, knowing obviously that a lot of aid was not getting in, but also just generally knowing that people in Gaza have sort of had to deal with so many situations like this before, we started our line of questioning with, how are you supporting each other? Where does that sort of reach its limits? And actually one of the discussions earlier, I'm not sure whether she's in the room, but there was someone on our table who was a student, and she was from Nigeria, and she said, I wonder if we started more of our sort of assessment discussions with what would you be able to do for yourself if you had no aid at all, and then use that as the starting point for, and how can that sort of be supported from the background. I think just to say that until you start to provide those stories of people and their whole lives and their support systems and, the way that they intersect with the humanitarian system being actually often quite a small part of their life, then those sorts of fraudulent narratives are going to persist. And I think, I don't know, maybe this is hopeful. I'm sure you've got something to say about this with the nuance of your job. But I think that there is appetite for some more nuanced storytelling around that sort of assistance that meets people where they are and is able to recognise a lot of the work they're doing already and the non-humanitarian sources of assistance, doesn't diminish the value of that assistance, but you just don't need to talk about it in a way that's sort of so reductive and so basic. So I think there are attempts to do that, and there are certainly some agencies I think that you can tell are really sort of trying to do that. But I would say there's probably quite a long way to go.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Annie, if I could come to you, there's a question about censorship on social platforms and how you can navigate this during a humanitarian crisis. What's your sense? I mean, I think the question is kind of aimed towards aid actors, but do you have any thoughts on sort of how censorship should be kind of navigated in humanitarian communication and info?
I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer that question, but I can try.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we know, having talked to people at Access Now previously, that, I mean, depending on who you're talking about being censored, that all the platforms that everybody uses, you know, certain voices are elevated, certain ones are not. I think I mean, I don't know about you guys, but when I open my phone, I'm a journalist, I don't necessarily go straight to the news. I probably open my Instagram first. And, you know, certain voices are shadow banned, certain voices are lifted, and certain are not. So I don't know if we want to call that exactly censorship or not. But I think it's really, really important to be aware of who the media is choosing to speak with, who aid groups and their communications are choosing to speak with, who they're choosing not to speak with. Maybe, like you said, people don't necessarily want to hear the stuff that's not so great about their aid programs. I guess maybe for me, I mean, I think there's probably much smarter people working on how to deal with censorship, but you know, knowing what your trusted sources of information are, and also I would like to make a pitch for talking to trusted media, including local journalists, because for me, something that happens all the time is, and I'm sure you all know this if you work in aid, most of the people doing the work on the ground are from the communities that are themselves in these situations. The same thing is true for journalists. This is doubly, triply, I don't know, true in Gaza right now. It happens, and these are the people that are also most in danger. It happens all the time that I'll be working with a journalist who approaches some kind of NGO or aid agency for a comment, and they do not reply to them. They just don't talk to local journalists, and they will reply to me. I think this does not build trust with communities at all, and it's not a way to elevate, I would think, the voices that you want to be hearing from, the people who are actually writing stories about stuff that's happening in their communities on the ground, that have the best view. So, I mean, my answer is probably not really about censorship, other than you need to be aware that everything you see is being filtered by some company, and also by your own biases, and it's something that we all, you know, have to tackle. Try to do better.
There's a good challenge to
Thanks,
there. And I think, Stein, do you want to come in on this one? And then I've got a question for you as well.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely, yet again, a lot of people who I have a lot more to say about this, but like I did want to start by saying that we're looking at Gaza, and obviously a very cruel, direct way of censoring is the fact that, like, if I might be off, but I think the last time that I looked at it, 122 journalists and media workers have been killed in Gaza. That's, of course, a very concrete way of silencing a certain part of the population, or a certain population at large. But I think I want to say something positive about this as well. I work for an organization, Internews. We work with local journalists and media around the world. We have a very much like a human rights basis for our organization, but sometimes the humanitarian angle provides an opportunity as well. While the human rights framework very quickly ends up in, you know, like, let's say, a political framework and alliances and geopolitics and choosing sides and supporting activists, which is a whole world that humanitarians are not very comfortable with in general. However, I think with our humanitarian framework, where we want to work with those who need it most, the most marginalized population, the most at-risk populations. Like, I think we should actually play our role in saying that's regardless of where you're from. And yes, yeah, humanitarian principles, I think we all know them by heart. We can actually play a role in making sure that in very dire circumstances, we focus on those parts of the populations and those populations who are not heard. And with our humanitarian mandate, we can also use that when it comes to communication and information, and making sure that we do provide avenues, channels, platforms, without putting people at risk, to have certain stories reach a wider audience. So I think maybe that was maybe a little twist of giving it,
of course, yeah.
Like the positive twist. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think, thank you for pointing out the more obvious censorship, the violent censorship. I think one, which reminds me also that a conversation we were having with people from Access Now who work on internet and tech stuff, which is really not me, but you know, I've been reading up on it, and we're saying that these days internet access can be as important of a humanitarian good as food or as you know, as shelter, and that I think they're probably, when it comes to censorship, when we talk about internet shutoffs in places like Gaza, but also Pakistan. I mean, it's a very long list, which limits people's access to information, is sort of the ultimate censor, other than violence. And I think this seems like something humanitarian community doesn't really engage with, which I think there is a role there that for it to play.
Absolutely, and that's very much at the heart of CEDAC's work as well with its members, is to really sort of highlight the importance of information as a form of aid in itself, and to give the Gaza example about how jamming, for example, meant that people were not able to use their phones or to contact loved ones, you know, during that sort of, especially during the early days of the violence. We're running out of time now, so I think we could maybe come to some concluding reflections, and you know, I think it would be great if we could sort of think about, for people in the room, for people joining online, what are some of the things that people could take away from this discussion that they can maybe, you know, take on board or to heart in their own work, as well as maybe challenging their own agencies or collectives to do better. So maybe if I could come to you first, Meg, what would you want people to leave the room thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I stick to my kind of egos theme,
Yeah.
I think there's an opportunity in the need at the moment to prioritise. And if people sort of take that as an opportunity to say, clearly as a humanitarian sector, whatever that means now, we don't have all the answers. And maybe at the community level, people don't have all the answers, but there is an opportunity for more of an honest discussion about pointing to something you said about limitations. There's this great example of someone that we spoke to in Chad who said, I know that there's not enough money because I saw online, you know, this response is like whatever, 40% funded or something. So don't come and ask me about everything I need when I know that I'm not going to get it. But, you know, let's have a discussion about what might be the best thing that could work in this community. And I think there's a real opportunity there for sort of saying none of us have all the answers, which is why we have conferences like this all the time. So maybe the more transparent we are about those limitations, and the more we can bring in an open conversation, then potentially there'll be some more organic ways out of some of these big humanitarian problems.
Thank you. So more honesty. If Annie, what about you?
Well, I think maybe something you said about sort of the opportunity for nuance in how we tell stories is something that I think about a lot in my job, and sort of one of my guiding principles, which I try to think about in anything that I do at work or in life, is that people are a lot more than what happened to them on the worst day of their lives, which I think is pretty basic, but I think is something that journalists can easily miss, that comms people can easily miss, that when we talk about people in these situations, when we're in these situations ourselves, we don't necessarily we don't necessarily manage to communicate. So I think keeping that in mind is really important, and I think that's related to just meeting people where they're at. Talk to people in the way that they talk to each other. It's probably actually not that complicated if we get down to it.
Thanks, Annie. And I think for me also what Ahmed shared with us at the beginning illustrated that sort of point about being a lot more than you are in the kind of worst moment of your life or being in a very dangerous situation, about how for him as a conflict advisor, and as he said in his own words, had more sort of options and resources than most. It was still incredibly difficult when he was in that situation to be getting the information that he needed as well, despite his sort of being part of this sort of sector and kind of being an expert in conflict dynamics. Stein, we've got 40 seconds. The clock is
no pressure.
Flashing to me, so
be amazing.
Yes.
I would echo, of course, what the other panelists have said, but I would add diversity. Truth is not one thing. Truth is something that has many aspects, and people want to see their perspective reflected in that. And so I say, rather than trying to centralize and control, we should embrace the diversity that you will always find locally and work with that.
Brilliant. Thank you for doing that so succinctly as well. And thank you again for coming in at short notice. We've run out of time, so I just want to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists, Meg, Annie, Stein and Ahmed as well. And thank you very much for joining.